The last capstone lurched in the wind before it dropped into place. Jonah Sutter drove a cottonwood lever under the block and threw his shoulder into it. The storm coming over Crowbreak Basin had turned the air sharp enough to taste like iron held between the teeth. For 10 weeks, he and his family had dragged red ironstone from the slope and stacked it into a crescent wall below the cliff. Now it stood almost 9 feet high, wide enough to catch the late sun, thick enough, Jonah hoped, to stand between his family and a Wyoming winter. Then the stone cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one clean snap across the top course. The kind of sound that made every man on a frontier farm stop breathing for half a second. At the same moment, Everett Calder reined his horse beside the unfinished gate. Calder owned half the valley and most of the notes inside it. His eyes moved from the fractured stone to Jonah's torn hands, then to the little cabin crouched under the cliff. "Rock won't put supper on a plate in February," he said. There was no anger in the sentence. That made it colder. When Calder rode away, Jonah stepped through the gate and stood inside the broken crescent. Outside the wall, the wind came hard enough to shove grit across the basin floor. Inside, the air hardly moved. Jonah pressed his bleeding palm against the stone. It still held the day's warmth. Not enough to comfort a man, just enough to make him stay. The crack in that wall was not the failure everyone in Crowbreak expected. It was the first visible seam in a machine nobody else had learned how to see. Jonah and Mara Sutter reached Crowbreak Basin in the spring of 1883. After 7 years of moving behind other men's maps, Jonah had worked survey chains for a stage road company, then for a freight outfit pushing wagon routes across Nebraska, Dakota country, and the high dry edges of Wyoming Territory. Most men on those crews learned mileage. Jonah learned what land tried to hide. He learned that dark rock gave heat back long after pale soil had gone cold. He learned that snow told the truth about wind better than any flag. He learned that a canyon bend could split a gale the way a knife split cloth, and that a slope facing the wrong direction could shorten a growing season by a month. Mara learned different things. She learned which camps had women who shared seed. She learned how to stretch meal until it looked like a meal. She learned the silence a man carried when he had no land of his own. So when Everett Calder offered them a cheap parcel at the back of Crowbreak Basin, they both understood that cheap meant punished. The soil was white with mineral bite. Ironstone shouldered up everywhere beneath the surface. The basin took wind from 2 directions in winter. One cold stream from the north cuts, another from the open prairie. Men in town said the place could graze a few stubborn cattle in summer, and disappoint a farmer the rest of the year. But behind the cabin rose the reason Mara did not turn away. A wall of red cliff lifted from the southeastern edge of the ground, stained copper in the evening light. Long after the valley floor had gone blue with cold, that stone still glowed. Mara stood with her shawl tight around her throat and stared at it. "The hill is keeping the day," she said. Jonah did not answer. He put one hand against the cliff after sunset and felt the faint warmth beneath his fingers. He remembered it. The first winter corrected every hope he brought to Crowbreak. Their potatoes froze under the crust before the tops had fully browned. Beans blackened after the first early frost. Cabbage seedlings vanished beneath wind. Packed ice. Snow did not settle evenly across the parcel. It buried some places waist deep and left others scraped nearly bare, as if the basin itself was choosing what lived and what did not. The town chose its explanation quickly. Bad land, bad judgment. Another family learning too late that a deed did not mean a future. Jonah chose a slower explanation. He began walking the property at dawn and again after sundown. He pressed his hand to gravel, soil, cliff, fence post, frozen ditch. He marked where the snow melted first and where frost returned soonest. He tied rag strips to willow stakes and watched how wind bent around the cliff instead of simply crossing the basin. By January, his notebook was stiff with dirt and candle grease. By February, Crowbreak had begun laughing. Silas Crow, a rancher with a voice trained by whiskey and weather, announced outside the feed store that Jonah Sutter was trying to grow dinner out of rocks. The men around him laughed with the easy relief of people watching failure happen to someone else. Reverend Thomas Wren never laughed. He was more careful. On Sunday, he spoke of pride wearing the mask of wisdom, and of men who confused hardship with a calling. No name was spoken. No name was needed. A week later, the Reverend's wife, Lottie Wren, came to the Sutter cabin with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Charity was the reason she gave. Inspection was the reason she stayed. She looked at Jonah's wind stakes, the stones piled by size, the notebook open beside the stove. Then she asked Mara if she had truly made peace with another winter on that ground. Mara looked through the window toward the fence line. "How long does snow cling to the north side of your barn after a warm day?" she asked. Lottie blinked. Mara had already learned the shape of Jonah's obsession. It was not rocks. It was not stubbornness. It was the way warmth behaved when nobody was watching. When the thaw came, Jonah stopped guessing and began testing. He built low beds of black gravel below the cliff, and covered one with oiled muslin stretched over a cedar frame. He set a second bed in open ground for comparison. He buried jars at different depths, and checked the frost line with a wire probe he made from a broken trap spring. Some tests gave him hope. Most took it back. One April night, damp air condensed beneath the muslin. By morning, the inside of the frame had become a clear coffin of ice. Every mustard sprout beneath it stood upright and dead, preserved in the exact posture of almost surviving. Mara found Jonah sitting beside the frame before sunrise. He did not curse. He did not break it apart. He opened the notebook and wrote, "Warmth trapped, moisture trapped, heat stolen at freeze." That line changed him more than any success could have. Failure stopped being a verdict. It became a measurement. In late summer, Jonah's mother arrived from the Iowa Bluff country in the back of a freight wagon, wedged between flour sacks and shovel handles. Ruth Sutter was 62, widowed, narrow, shouldered, and harder to discourage than any person Jonah had ever known. She brought 2 bundles of seed, 1 packet of old frost beans, and 40 years of watching winter move over open ground. For 2 days, she said almost nothing about Jonah's plan. She touched the ironstone. She watched dust slide along the basin floor. She stood outside at dusk with her eyes half closed, while the wind shifted from the north cut to the prairie gap. On the 3rd evening, Jonah showed her the line of stakes for the wall he meant to build straight across the lower garden. Ruth took the willow stick from his hand. "No," she said. Jonah stiffened. Ruth drew in the dirt, not a wall, but a broad crescent. Its back turned toward the worst wind and its open mouth angled toward the winter sun. The thickest part sat northwest, where crosswinds hit hardest. The inside curve leaned toward the warm cliff. "A straight wall catches snow and pressure," she said. "A bent wall teaches them where to go." A gust moved down from the cut as she finished the shape. Dust struck the drawn crescent and split around it. Mara saw it first. Jonah saw it 1 second later. After that, the wall in his mind was no longer a fence. It was a piece of weather. Everett Calder came for the account in October before the first killing cold. But after the Sutter harvest had failed badly enough to count from the road, he brought the papers folded inside his coat. "March," he said. "If the balance is not paid by then, the place returns to me." Jonah did not argue. There was no money to argue with, no crop, no animals worth selling except a tired mule named Orrin, no neighbors eager to lend to a man building experiments out of hunger. That night, Jonah, Mara, and Ruth spread every note across the table. Wind direction, stone warmth, snow depth, freeze time, seed failure, muslin failure, gravel depth. The numbers did not show a path to paying the note. They showed only one narrow chance. The land had to make food when food was not supposed to grow. 3 days later, they began quarrying stone. The ironstone broke badly. Some blocks came free in clean red slabs. Others shattered under the wedge and spilled useless chips down the slope. Orrin dragged the good pieces on a sled built from old wagon runners. The rawhide lashings screamed every time a load shifted on frozen ground. The work tore skin from Jonah's palms and left Mara's shoulders bruised purple beneath her dress. Ruth carried smaller stone until her breath whistled in the cold, then carried another. Week by week, the crescent rose wide through the middle, narrow at the sunward mouth, thick at the windward spine. Jonah left low gaps near the base where Ruth told him pressure needed somewhere to escape. He set jagged short stones along the outer curve, not pretty, but angled to break clean wind before it could sweep into the center. Mara called them teeth. The name stayed. The first time the wall changed the air, it happened near dusk. Jonah stepped inside with wind roaring over the open basin behind him. The gale still existed. He could hear it battering the outside stone. But inside the crescent, it no longer struck his chest. It moved around him. That night, Jonah placed 3 thermometers, one outside the wall, one in the center bed, one against the cliff. 2 hours after sunset, the inside of the crescent stayed 7 degrees warmer than the open basin. Near midnight, it was still 5 degrees warmer. Not enough for comfort. Enough to prove difference. In Crowbreak, difference could be the width of a grave. But heat alone did not make soil alive. The ground inside the wall remained pale, tight, and mean. So the Sutters began hauling black silt from an old flood bend, nearly a mile north, where spring water had left dark layers beneath the crust. They mixed it with stove ash, rotted bedding, crushed straw, scraps from the creek edge, and the fine dust of broken charcoal. The loads grew heavier as winter came on. Food grew thinner. Mara watered beans longer before cooking, so the pot looked fuller. Ruth broke cornbread smaller. Jonah pretended not to notice when both women left the last spoonful for him. One afternoon, Ruth stopped halfway across the basin with a carrying pole across her shoulders. She did not fall. She simply stood there. White breath moving in small bursts, hands still locked around the wood. Jonah turned back for her. She shook her head once and started walking again. No speech, no complaint. Just movement after comfort had already ended. Weeks later, Mara turned a fork through the new soil beneath the cliff and paused. Steam rose from it, barely visible. Then came the smell. Not ash, not rot earth. Jonah knelt beside her and pressed the dark mix between his fingers. It held moisture below the surface without surrendering it to frozen ground. That night, he wrote one sentence beneath the temperature tables. Soil has begun to remember life. The system needed tools nobody in Crowbreak sold. Jonah carried pieces of wagon spring to Ned Harrow's smithy and laid his drawings beside the forge. He asked for narrow trench blades to cut drainage under gravel beds, shallow hose that could stir warmed soil without turning up cold layers, and curved scrapers to shape small passages between stones. Ned stared at the drawings the way practical men stare at something that might be foolish, but is not stupid. From the back room his wife Clara coughed. The cough had stayed since November. Long winters with no fresh food did that in high country. They drained a body slowly enough that people called it weakness instead of hunger. Clara came to the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders and looked at Jonah's sketches. "I'd trade good iron for anything green by February," she said. Ned lifted one drawing again. Outside, Silas Crow's laugh rolled in from the street. "Sutter's making tools to plow a pile of stones," he called. Inside the smithy, Ned set the wagon spring in the coals. "I'll make them," he said. "You bring Clara the first leaves." Iron struck iron hard enough to cut the laughter short. The next problem appeared as a dark, wet line below the cliff. Mara noticed it before anyone else. Snow had melted in a narrow strip along the red rock, while everything beyond the wall remained locked white and hard. Jonah dug shallow pits for 3 mornings and found nothing except frozen shale. Ruth watched him waste strength, then climbed into the trench herself. "Too high," she said. "Water hides lower when the cold settles." So Jonah dug under the shale shelf instead of through it. There they found the seep. It was not a spring, not in the way hopeful people use that word. It was a thread of moving water, thin enough to disappear if a shadow crossed it. But it moved under the stone when every bucket outside froze solid. That was enough. They lined a run with flat rock, built a small holding basin, and cut an overflow path, so ice had somewhere to push when it expanded. The first hard freeze broke the clay seal anyway, and forced water backward beneath one gravel bed, stealing its heat before dawn. Jonah stood over the damage, too tired even to be angry. Ruth crouched, pressed loose gravel under the cracked clay, and said, "Hard things break clean, soft seams survive." They rebuilt the run with gravel beneath the joints and clay that could shift instead of shatter. 5 mornings later, the air outside was 12 below zero. The water still moved, a silver thread under ice. Mara knelt beside it and cried without making a sound, not because it was much, because it had not stopped. In December, an old seed trader named May Hollow came to the gate without knocking. She had spent years moving between abandoned mining camps and sheep outfits, trading herbs, seed, and weather scents for flour or cloth. Children called her witch. Their parents called her useful, only when they were desperate. May studied the crescent before she spoke. Her eyes moved over the wind teeth, the gravel beds, the oiled muslin frames, the trench still breathing water under its skin of ice. "You're not fighting winter," she said. "You're making it walk around you." It was the first time anyone outside the family had understood the thing in a single sentence. May brought miner's lettuce seed from a northern camp, a bitter mustard that had once grown beside warm boiler foundations, and a small handful of beans she claimed had survived 3 bad springs in the Black Hills. She did not hand them over until Jonah promised to write more than numbers. "Failures too," she said. "Methods, changes, reasons. Men die. Notes last longer if someone can read them." That night, Jonah's notebook changed again. He stopped writing only what happened. He began writing why. Why wet gravel could steal warmth. Why a curved wall carried snow pressure away from the beds. Why rigid clay cracked and loose seams moved. Why the cliff gave heat back slowly, after the open earth had gone dead cold. The notebook became less a record of one family's trial, and more a map of how to borrow summer from stone. Then came the cold that nearly ended the map. It fell to 26 below and held there. The wind shifted from the prairie gap into the north cut, then back again, dragging snow against the mouth of the crescent where sunlight had to enter. 2 frames froze solid. The muslin went stiff as boards. Mustard collapsed in dark ribbons under the ice. By the 3rd night, even the gravel beds were losing heat faster than the cliff could return it. Jonah sat beside the stove after midnight and saw the future with terrible clarity. In spring, Calder would take the deed. Jonah would hire back onto a freight route. Mara would pack the seed bundles. Ruth would say nothing and grow older in a place that had beaten them. Mara did not argue with him. She sat across from him and mended a glove that no longer had enough leather left to mend. Ruth lay awake on the bed, reciting figures into the dark. Bed 4, 2 inches deeper. Drainage clear at dusk. Frame angle wrong on the east side. Mustard threshold near 18. Not encouragement inventory. Before sunrise, Jonah walked to the crescent, expecting to find the last of it dead. The first frame had collapsed. The second was a block of cloudy ice. The third showed nothing but flattened stems. Then he reached the lowest frame, tucked close to the cliff where the curve held stillest. Inside, under a white crust of frost, one miner's lettuce sprout stood upright. Small, pale green. Alive, Jonah checked the thermometers with fingers that would not stop shaking outside the wall. 24 below. Inside the frame, 19 above 40. 3 degrees of difference, purchased by stone, soil, water, and every correction failure had forced on them. He sank into the snow beside that single sprout and laughed once. So quietly it sounded more like pain leaving his body. By the last week of January, the crescent was no longer an experiment. It was not abundance, it was not comfort. It was survival with roots. Miner's lettuce crept low across the warmest gravel beds. Bitter mustard thickened slowly under the oiled frames. Frost beans climbed badly but climbed. Jonah harvested only outer leaves, never enough to weaken the plants. Every cut was measured. Every handful had to become tomorrow's growth as well as tonight's food. The first evening the Sutters ate fresh greens. No one spoke. The lettuce tasted cold and clean. The mustard bit the tongue. After months of meal, beans, and salt pork, the sharpness felt almost impossible. The next morning, Jonah wrapped a small bundle and took it to Ned Harrow's smithy. Clara ate one leaf by the forge, slowly, as if she did not trust her mouth to understand it. By sunset, Crowbreak knew. Fresh greens in January did not belong in that country. The next day, Jonah carried 2 bunches to the store and traded them for flour and lamp oil. People gathered around the counter in silence. Silas Crow stood by the stove with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at the leaves as if they had insulted him. The storekeeper bit a mustard stem. The crisp sound seemed too loud for the room. Nobody laughed. Reverend Wren preached the next Sunday on humility. The word pride appeared only once, and even then it sounded weakened by weather. 3 days later, the real storm arrived. Jonah felt it first in the wrong stillness. The wind died before noon. Snowbirds vanished from the fence rails. The pressure made the cabin door stick in its frame. He harvested every mature leaf he dared take and banked snow away from the sunward mouth of the crescent. At nightfall, the blizzard hit. It erased fence lines before midnight. It buried 2 wagons south of the bend. It drove cattle against broken windbreaks and froze water buckets, solid inside sheds. Inside the crescent, the wall held but barely. The water run slowed under ice. Snow piled against the opening and narrowed the little winter light that could enter. Near dawn, a stone in the western spine cracked as frozen ground heaved under it. Jonah and Mara went out with lanterns, shovels, and Ned's trench blade. Wind hit them so hard the flame nearly died inside the glass. Mara dropped to her knees at the run and hacked packed snow with gloves already wet. Jonah broke ice from the overflow cut until his wrists burned. The water moved again just as morning stained the storm gray. By the second day, people began coming to the gate. Ned came first, Clara wrapped in a blanket behind him, asking if there were any leaves left. Then Silas Crow arrived with snow frozen into his beard. His youngest boy had bleeding gums and legs too weak for chores. Silas could not look Jonah in the face. Jonah gave him mustard. Anyway, near midnight, Reverend Wren appeared at the gate alone. His daughter had fever, and had not kept food down in 2 days. The Reverend stood in the storm with his hat in both hands, the man who had once warned Crowbreak against mistaking hardship for purpose. For a moment, he and Jonah listened to the blizzard strike the wall. Then Jonah opened the gate. When the storm passed, Crowbreak looked buried out of memory. Roads were gone. Fence tops had vanished. Chimneys and rooflines stood from the snow like the last pieces of a drowned town. But outside the Sutter crescent, the drifts were cut by tracks, dozens of them, boot tracks, wagon tracks, the deep punched holes of men carrying children, all pressed into one narrow path through the white. Every line led to the stone gate. That was when the valley understood, not fully, not scientifically, but enough. The wall had not made winter kind. It had made one place where winter did not get the final word. Spring came late that year, and it brought a new danger instead of relief. Freight teams from the south carried word that blight had ruined much of the spring seed stock across 3 settlements. Prices rose before the roads had fully cleared. Families who had survived the winter now faced planting season with poor seed, old seed, or none at all. Everett Calder walked to the Sutter cabin through thaw mud. He did not ride. That mattered. Men rode when they meant to speak from height. They walked when they needed something. Inside, Jonah opened the notebook on the table. Mara set out trays of starts hardened in shallow stone beds. Ruth unfolded cloth packets labeled by date, bed, freeze, and yield. Miner's lettuce, frost beans, bitter mustard. Seeds kept alive through the winter, everyone said could not feed a family. Calder studied the pages for a long time. Then he looked through the window at the crescent below the red cliff. Snow still lay outside the wall. Inside it, green rose had already taken hold. Only then did he understand the scale of his mistake. Jonah had not built a garden. He had built a way to keep seed breathing when the whole valley went cold. By midsummer, Crowbreak began to change. Small crescent walls rose behind cabins that had mocked the first one. Oiled muslin frames appeared beside barns. Gravel beds showed up near warm foundations and creek bends. Ned Harrow made trench blades until his hammer arm ached. Even Silas Crow built a curved stone windbreak behind his stable and told no jokes while doing it. Reverend Wren preached that autumn about wisdom proven by endurance. Nobody asked whether he meant Jonah. Everybody knew. Jonah did not give speeches. He did not name the system after himself. He kept writing. Stone temperature after sunset. Wind shift before snow. Drainage depth. Seed saved. Frame angle corrected failure. Cause repair. Years later, travelers passing through Crowbreak noticed something strange about the valley. In winter, the gardens did not sit naked in the open. They bent toward the southeastern sun behind low red walls. The snow melted first along dark stone edges. Green things appeared early where they had no right to appear. And in Jonah Sutter's notebook beneath the last entry of that first winter, there was one sentence written darker than the rest. We did not beat the cold. We taught stone to remember summer.